Hey everyone, it's me, Dr. Whimsy, and today we're talking about gluten, specifically wheat gluten, and we want to talk about whether or not gluten is responsible for your depression. The reason I decided to cover this video, and hopefully we'll be able to do this video in under 10 minutes, is because many people have spoken to me about the fact that they experience mood changes after consuming wheat. Now, to be clear, this is anecdotal. There's no scientific test that can determine whether or not the depression is due to wheat, but we do know a little bit about some theories regarding why mood and emotions could be impacted by people who consume wheat. And there's been some interesting studies on wheat and mental health. One of the most interesting studies that I saw regarded feeding wheat to people who suffer from schizophrenia and then removing wheat for a period of, I think the experiment, it might have been done in some Scandinavian country. I can go back and look at the data. But basically, they took a group of hospitalized schizophrenics and they removed gluten from the diet. I believe the period was 6 weeks, and they noted a reduction in various different symptoms associated with schizophrenia, for example, auditory hallucinations, and they noted that some of the symptoms had been dramatically reduced. Other experiments have been done on autistic children with some emotional disorders, symptoms that are associated with autism, and they found improvement in mood and behavior when gluten was removed. Then when gluten was put back into the diet, they found that symptoms returned in both of those populations. I've also seen studies where experiments like that have been done and we've seen mixed results. So now people are trying to figure out, scientists are trying to figure out if there is a mood association, if there's an association with mood, auditory hallucinations in schizophrenics, emotionally distraught behavior in autistic children, chronic depression, and an increase in emotionally disturbed behavior in people who suffer from underlying mental health conditions. If that's happening, and if it's being aggravated by gluten, why do we think that that's happening? And one of the theories has to do with the polypeptides. These are small protein units that are found in gluten. And what they think might be happening is that when the gluten is digested in our stomachs, it's broken down into small substances, small amino acid sequences called polypeptides that actually they're absorbed in the small intestine, and then they do cross the blood-brain barrier. And these polypeptides have been called gluteomorphins. They're gluteomorphins, they cross the blood-brain barrier, and then when they meaning that they can cross into the brain, small substances can cross into the brain, larger substances cannot. This is basically how drug therapy works. If a substance is small enough to cross the blood-brain barrier, then it can have an effect theoretically on brain health. Whereas if a molecule is too large or is not able to cross the blood-brain barrier, then theoretically it won't. An example would be an antihistamine that doesn't cause grogginess. The molecule doesn't cross into the blood-brain barrier and inhibit histamine in the brain, causing drowsiness, and so consequently you'll have systemic inhibition of histamine, but you won't have the groggy side effects. An example would be non-drowsy Claritin. So that is the whole argument of the blood-brain barrier and why certain substances will have an impact on brain health. In this case, the gluteomorphins from wheat that are small, that cross the blood-brain barrier, they get to the brain, they bind to something called a receptor site, specifically an opioid receptor site. This is the same part of the cell that opium and opium-like pharmaceuticals bind to, like oxycodone. Now that's kind of interesting because we give medications like naloxone, these medications that are given to inhibit opioids in people who've had a drug overdose. Now, these medications, naloxone and some of these medications that are blocking opioids, seem to also have an impact on mood in people that have consumed gluten. And in fact, we find that gluteomorphins are blocked by these opioid antagonists. It's a class of medication called an opioid antagonist. Now, these polypeptides, these exomorphins, are also being researched for causing other types of problems, emotional disturbances in people who may, for example, be underdiagnosed for celiac disease. Celiac disease that's also has comorbidity with depression, anxiety, premenstrual dysphoria. Those are some of the symptom picture that we're looking at, and why we might see emotional disturbance in people who have either celiac disease, which is an autoimmune condition, or a wheat allergy or wheat sensitivity. The last thing that I would point out is that sometimes we see, particularly in the autoimmune conditions, chronic inflammation. And that's because the immune system has been ramped up, like in the case of celiac disease. And if it's underdiagnosed, which it often is, we might see in response to that inflammation an elevation in cortisol. Now, when we have an elevation in cortisol, that can have an impact on serotonin levels, also in other neurotransmitters, because cortisol actually can suppress inflammation, and cortisol, that whole axis, can suppress production of neurotransmitters like serotonin, and that in turn can have an impact on mood. An example from an evolutionary perspective, I started off as an anthropologist before I went to naturopathic medical school. An example of this would be ancient Ireland. I like to give ancient Ireland as an example of this, where people would often go long periods of time with insufficient food or inadequate food in the wintertime, and so they would go into a semi-hibernated state. People would sew themselves up into their clothing, they would gather as much food as they could for the wintertime, and then they would hunker down for these incredibly cold winters with very, very little food, and they would become depressed and they would sleep. And so elevated cortisol slows down metabolism, but it also can lead to a chronic need to sleep and depression. And that is in fact the symptom picture we see with chronic inflammatory diseases, autoimmune conditions, celiac disease that's not being adequately treated, and the relationship between chronic inflammation and depression. It's that elevation in inflammation leading to elevations in cortisol, leading to changes in serotonin levels. Why we see it in a fasting population is because the fasting induces cortisol, because cortisol will slow down metabolism, and that in turn, you guessed it, changes serotonin levels. So where do we go from here? What does all of this have to do with health? Well, the simple explanation would be that you can talk to your healthcare provider about removing gluten from the diet, usually for about 6 to 8 weeks, and see if there's any change in mood. The last thing I would say about gluten and why it might have an impact on mood has to do with blood sugar dysregulation. And that's because wheat, even whole wheat, has a very high glycemic index, and so consequently we can see huge changes in blood sugar, spikes in blood sugar and then drops in blood sugar. And what happens when you have spikes in blood sugar and then drops in blood sugar? You have changes in energy, but you also have rises in insulin and rises in cortisol, which again can have an effect on neurotransmitters. So that again is the correlation we're seeing between wheat consumption and depression. All right, there, I did it in under 10 minutes. If anyone wants to reach out to me and ask me some more questions about this, I'd love to answer those questions. And if you'd like to find out more about my work, You can go to drwhimsy.com. I'd love to answer your questions. And if you'd like to schedule a telemedicine appointment for general wellness, I'll leave that information below as well. I'm available here in Los Angeles, though, if you'd like to see me directly. Thanks for watching, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Take care. Bye.